Philip Hellyer. The topic is From Zero to EA.
This is a story. It's actually a continuation of a story. So one of my clients, for Key Retirement, Darren and I gave the first version of this talk a little over a year ago at the IRM EA conference in June in London. And so in some ways this is a continuation of that story to say what we've achieved. Can everyone hear me? Yes? No? Brilliant. All right, don't need one of those. So it's a continuation of that. But I thought, rather than do just a case study, because we see lots of case studies and they tend to be a little bit dry and occasionally informative, is that I noticed that the overall theme of this conference is about making EA relevant. And I thought, what is it that made EA relevant at Key Retirement? How did we get there? Because this is a company that started without any enterprise architecture. They had an idea one day as they were growing that things were getting a bit messy, and maybe they needed to find out something about what we do and could use some of us. But they didn't know what it was that they wanted. And it certainly wasn't, I think, the technical skill that I brought to this engagement that made it a success. It's the things beyond technical skill, it's the soft skills, it's all the things that make EA actually have an impact, that make it matter. And I suppose, before I talk a little bit too much about Key Retirement and the work there, is a little bit to say about me. Because my entire life seems like it has been a balancing act between where I've come from and a desired future. From an education perspective, I studied accounting, I studied computing science, I studied humanities. And naturally that led me to becoming a programmer, because that's where the jobs were. And from there, I became an architect, because they give you bigger programs to write and teams of people to run and so on. And from there to be an enterprise architect, where you're really spending a lot of time helping different groups of people actually communicate. Even if they're using the same words, they often have different meanings for them. And we spend a lot of time helping people who think they're communicating actually have conversations that mean something. And I spent my last few years as an enterprise architect being the EA group lead at Carco Warehouse, which is a bigger company than you might expect. But even that has been difficult, because I think as enterprise architects we often have quite technical backgrounds, which then leads us to try and solve problems in slightly technical, mechanical ways. We think, if only we could model things in enough detail, all the messy problems would go away. And they don't. And so I've always had an interest in behavioral psychology, and I discovered, as I sought new ways to approach the problems that were interesting to me as an enterprise architect, but that my tools were insufficient for, I discovered things like systems thinking and like enterprise design. And so now I spend an awful lot of my time doing things that might be enterprise architecture and they might not. I do some design facilitation, enterprise design sprints. I do some coaching of people who've got deep technical skills but who struggle with the people and the politics and getting beyond where their skills have taken them. Because often our strengths then at some point become our weaknesses. And I put this slide together because every good consultant has got a logo slide. And I was a bit surprised how many there are. So I've been independent for 3 years, and I've had the privilege of working with those organisations. Some of them have been enterprise design recently, a lot of them have involved systems thinking, and some of them have even thought they're doing enterprise architecture. But the interesting thing of, as I do whatever it is I've been hired to do, because there's always this difference between what the organisation is willing to buy and what we're able to do and what we're able to achieve with them, and trying to marry those things up. I have found that when I'm successful, it is because I've worked as much with the people and the sponsor as I have on the technical challenge. The technological skill of the engagement is never quite enough. But officially, here, we're talking about Key Retirement. And I've been involved with Key for about 2.5 years. They were undergoing a period of rapid growth, increasing amounts of chaos, increasing amounts of entropy, and an awful lot of investment. They decided that they wanted to introduce a CRM system, which seems like a sensible thing to do for a growing company. And then they discovered that in order to do CRM, they needed to replace their version of the operating system. And then they discovered that in order to do that, they needed to replace all of their infrastructure. And so all of this change has snowballed. And at the point that I arrived, it was in full flight. So it was about how do we get going from there. It's interesting, I was brought in not through IT. The chap who first brought me to their attention was the Chief Operating Officer. So I'll talk about what they do in a second, I think. But my sponsor in the organisation was the Director of Customer Engagement, which I think is not a normal place for enterprise architects to work. And yet, it probably is the place that we need to be in order to make EA relevant, to deal with the people and the politics, and to make decisions that have consequences. You need a certain amount of structure and clout that comes from the people you're working with. So, key retirement, in a nutshell. They do mortgages that you don't have to pay back. So they're in a regulated environment. They're doing what's known as equity release. They have got the lion's share, well, in this case about a third. They are the market leader in their sector, even though you may never have heard of them until you reach a certain age. They've got two sides to their business, in effect. They've got the retail arm, where they act as an independent broker and furnish loans from lots of places and do advice. And they have the lending arm, where they get money from funders and they distribute it to brokers, including themselves. Now, both of those are double-sided markets and complicated in their own right, and yet we have an organisation with both of them. And they're private equity backed, which means that they've got a slightly different group of shareholders and stakeholders that we often deal with. And if that weren't enough, they are still probably technically an SME, but they are rapidly growing, and they just need a little bit of a new funder to come online, and they will be tipped over from being medium to being large, which has got some good impact. In fact, they've changed hands while we've been working together. So, from zero to EA, what does zero actually mean? And in this case, it meant a highly dynamic, very entrepreneurial, rapidly growing, wildly successful company. Zero is not nothing. Zero is just where they are. Because every organisation has got an architecture, whether it's been expressed and formalised or not. Every organisation has got a culture, whether it's recognised and managed or not. And the value of the work that we do as enterprise architects is unique to the context in which we're working. It's unique to the organisation, and it's unique to the individuals in that organisation. And Darren, my sponsor for this, is probably a good example, because we started working together, and he was the Director of Customer Engagement, and he's now the Chief Technology Officer, which is hard to say. But anyway, so that is effective enterprise architecture, when you actually have impact on people's careers. You know, that is relevance as enterprise architecture. That is architecture that has consequences. And if the work that we do doesn't have consequences on the organisation, we probably shouldn't bother. And the organisations that we work in have got contexts of their own and constituencies that continuously evolve. Enterprise architecture doesn't happen in a vacuum, and I think we're getting increasingly good at recognising it, at seeking where the edge of the organisation is, where the edge of our architecture ought to be, and trying to figure out which bits of this picture will stand still long enough for us to model it and to do some architecture with it and make changes, and which bits do we just have to accept are going to carry on changing. Because these wheels within wheels will keep turning, whether we like it or not, and if we don't pay attention to them, they will crush us by default. That is the default position, is that we will be destroyed by them, and they keep moving, which means that that becomes our strategy as architects. We have to embrace the fact that everything else is changing, and that it is generally stronger than we are. And at the point that Key Retirement and I started working together, they were in a world, as I said, where they've got increasing scope, their complexity has skyrocketed, their costs are going through the roof, IT costs. They've engaged in replacing everything, the infrastructure, the operating systems, moving to cloud, and both of the core applications for both sides of the businesses all at once in a big bang fashion, without any architecture. And the scariest thing in the world is that they succeeded, because now they think they're invincible. It's staggering. But the challenge and the balance there of doing it well versus delivering things, they were always on the deliver, do it now. And so we're trying to introduce a little bit of rigor into the chaos, but maintaining the balance so that they don't lose the forward momentum. Because if we tell them to stop, there goes the CEO sponsorship, there goes the private equity's interest in what we do. We become policemen that they don't want to talk to. And that is a terrible place to be as an enterprise architect. So, what do? I think one of the benefits to dealing with architects and externals is that we introduce models to the organization. And they're not always models that we recognize as enterprise architects. They're often non-traditional. Some of them are EAs. I mean, I've introduced models from Sally and from Tom Graves and other people. Anyway, I've even introduced models from Gartner and TOGAF, and they're all okay. They're all useful, they're all slightly wrong, they're all good enough for some purposes. And so much of this work is context specific. This particular model comes from the design world. It's the double diamond that probably everyone has seen by now that came out of the UK Design Council. And designers are interesting, I think, for us as enterprise architects, because they often wrestle with problems that have got multiple dimensions and conflicting stakeholders and constraints that just make no sense. And yet somehow they come out the other side with a design that is, in the best cases, coherent and fits the needs of everybody involved, with a view and a connection to the outside world, which we sometimes lack as architects. This particular model is one in which the world diverges and then comes together again. Whether you're thinking that as defining a problem and then defining a solution, or discovering something and developing it. But it's also a model that is itself insufficient, because the original one, for example, doesn't come together with an overlap. It comes together at a point, as though there is an actual point in the process in which you understand the problem and you stop thinking about the problem and start thinking about the solution. When, of course, the world is a little bit more cyclical and iterative than that. And that these things overlap and that they carry on going pretty much forever. There's not one diamond, and they're not necessarily all the same size. Because if we think of when I started with Key Retirement, it was, they'd already committed to an enormous investment in change. That was part, effectively, of their as-is, even though it hadn't happened yet. And then we had a bunch of work that had to do with packaging them for sale, because they knew that they wanted to change from one equity partner to the other. They just needed to find the right partner. And that turns out to be surprisingly architectural in terms of it affects what you invest in, how you invest in it, what things you highlight to who, and so on. But one of the interesting things to me about thinking of the world as a series of these diamonds is that question of what phase are we in? Are we expanding? Are we contracting? We know that this event is coming down the pipe towards us. Where do we want it to hit? Where does our mindset as an organization need to be in order to deal with that change when it happens? And one of the things that will happen, for example, and possibly why I've talked about roadmaps rather than a roadmap, is that the lending arm of their business is very much driven by even bigger lenders, that they call funders, that provide big blocks of money with specific requirements. And that's where large chunks of their growth will come from. And they know, as they're courting several of these funders, that sooner or later one of them will arrive and sign a contract. And as soon as that does, the entire organization will stop everything that it is doing and do the development that's needed to deliver the funding. So one of the architectural questions we had to deal with is how do you do a change program that accommodates the fact that you're going to stop everything and divert all your resource? What's the right level of resource to keep you ticking along with the level of change that you're comfortable with, that you're also comfortable with stopping and freeze drying and picking up again later? Which brings us, I suppose, a little bit to the whole point of enterprise architecture is better outcomes, and it's better outcomes through people. Because the core question sometimes is one that's on my slide but not yours, which is who needs to see what difference? You know, whether it's the CEO needs to see something, or the investors need to see something, or even somebody, a team member down at the front line. What do they need to see happening that gives them the comfort and the confidence to move forward in ways that you think might be helpful? You know, how do we focus on the relationships and the wholes rather than on the pieces? Because as architects, we're often comfortable with looking at what's inside a box and what the interfaces to that box need to be, and maybe less comfortable at looking at how things are connected and what the implications of those connections are going to be. And taking advantage of the here and now. What are people interested in right now? What are they going to pay attention to? Because we didn't go in and try and do out-of-the-box enterprise architecture, here's your stack of shelfwares and all your complete models. We did the things that the organization was interested in hearing about. You know, the value, for example, for the whole business and the people. One of the tests of whether a meeting is a good meeting is if people want to turn up to it. I think we've probably all worked in places with mandatory meetings that the room is empty. That is not a meeting that adds value to the organisation. It's not been pitched in the right way. It's not, you know it's successful when the head of change who never comes to anybody's meetings comes to your meeting. That is success. And then they forget that they never used to go to anybody else's meetings, and they think they've always come to yours, and it's completely normal. And that is one of the real challenges with enterprise architecture, is that success is invisible. When we do it right, we change how people think. And when we change how people think, they don't remember that they used to think differently. And that is really hard, because we get to sit on our hands and bite our tongues and not claim credit. It's hard. And at the same time, we have to make sure that the sponsors who brought us in know that it was me, you know? But it is intangible. It is really, really ridiculously difficult. And I've got a notion here about pushing the boulder downhill. And there's probably a whole other talk in that somewhere that has to do with variety equations. So if you think from a systemic perspective, I think that it doesn't matter how big your enterprise architecture team is, that the complexity that we can tackle as individuals and as a team is dwarfed by the complexity of the size of the organisation. And so we always have to find situations where we actually have leverage, where people want to talk to us. And I think we're quite good at getting invited into meetings, at least once. And then we bang on the table and tell people how smart we are, and they don't invite us anymore. So staying, get to the table, but your number one job once you've been invited to a meeting is to get invited to the next one. Doesn't matter how wrong-headed they are.